situation where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.
I mean, why does 9/11 still matter? Well, because the events that we're seeing in the world today are still directly based on what happened back then. And you might have noticed that line in the song about our freedom slips away. And it really did. There's many things that, we used to take for granted that we had and the freedoms we had that really did slip away after 9/11. And of course now we've got generations that don't remember what it was like before then. So they might not have noticed necessarily how much has changed. 9/11 really matters, and we're going to see why. And actually, I just need to change one colour. Technical things. There we go. So this is a talk I've given over the years, here and there. I keep updating it, and we're going to look again at why 9/11, the official story, really cannot be true, or at least major aspects of it. And by saying this, I'm very aware that there's a lot of other versions out there, and you will find people saying, but it was this, and it was that, and they did it, and these people did it. We're not really going to do that today. What I want to do is to just identify what are the mysteries, what are the anomalies of 9/11, and there certainly aren't many of them. And one of the anomalies is that my clicker's not working. Hang on. It will work. So in the end, you're going to have to make up your own minds. And I'm aware there's a lot of diversity of opinion about 9/11 and what it all means. Is this going to work? Come on, please. Basil, would you be so kind? Mm-hmm. You're going to have to sit there and hit a button every now and then. Yep. I'll tell you what, I'll do the first one. It might start working in a minute. I had this at a talk the other day and I had to just throw it and then it worked. So let's see what happens. Let's remind ourselves of the basics here. So, according to the official story, Al-Qaeda got a bunch of guys together and they hijacked the planes and they flew them into buildings, apart from one that went wrong and crashed into a woods. But we're going to look at all aspects of this today. And we'll begin to understand that certainly, this is something with, shall we say, a background. Oh, I was working now. So you just throw something and it works. What is interesting is that the background goes back further than some know. Before we come to the obvious events, let's just go back in time. Because one of the things that never really made sense was their claim that it had never occurred to them that an aeroplane could ever hit a building or that anybody would ever do it deliberately. And yet, it had already happened in New York. Of course, planes have hit buildings all over the world in various circumstances. But we should, just mention that in 1945, B-25 Mitchell bomber crashed into the Empire State Building in the fog. And it was an accident, and there was a fire. Interestingly, it didn't knock the Empire State Building down, but, it wasn't unheard of, even in New York. They knew that this kind of thing could occur. And yet, somehow, they all managed to forget that. Now, Condoleezza Rice was the US Defense Secretary when 9/11 was going on, and when the 9/11 Commission began to look at all this later on, they had to talk about what they knew and what they didn't know. Her comments were interesting. I'll read some of it. I don't like lots of text on the screen, ideally, but sometimes you need to see what they said. I'll read this. And I said, no one could have imagined them taking a plane, slamming it into the Pentagon, I'm paraphrasing now, or into the World Trade Center, using planes as a missile. Well, I probably should have said, I could not have imagined, because within 2 days, people started to come to me and say, but there were these reports in 1998 and 1999. The intelligence community did look at information about this. To the best of my knowledge, Mr. Chairman, this kind of analysis about the use of airplanes as weapons actually was never briefed to us. So in other words, the official version here is that the intelligence community did know that there were plans for this kind of thing, but didn't actually pass it on to the main people in government. Now, you have to decide within yourselves whether you believe that or not. And we do know occasionally things don't get passed on, but it was a pretty major faux pas. But of course, those that believe that this was entirely a setup would say, well, yeah, there's good reasons why these warnings were not passed on. But everybody forgets that there was an earlier attempt to blow up the World Trade Center. It's extraordinary how little you ever hear about this now, but it was a really big thing in its day. So in 1993, on the 26th of February, there was a truck bomb underneath one of the towers in one of the car parks below. And it was pretty severe, and this was big news. So 6 people died, over 1,000 people were injured in this attack. And as far as we know, the idea was to blow up one of the towers, the foundations, and topple it into the other one, thus bringing them both down. So had that been successful, right, we could have had 9/11 a lot earlier. But isn't it weird how nobody talks about this? And when 9/11 came, nobody seemed to reference this. It's worth looking up this gentleman, a man called Imad Salem. Now he claims that he was working with the FBI, and he infiltrated the gang of Muslim terrorists who wanted to do this, and he knew therefore what they were planning. And the FBI said, right, what we'll do is we'll give you dummy explosives to put into the truck. Then you'll get the truck there, and then it won't go off, and then we'll catch them out. But of course, when the truck did get there, they'd given them live explosives, not dummy explosives. And Imad Salem said, this is crazy. It's almost like the authorities wanted this to actually occur. Now, they say the guy was a liar. They say he never worked for them. All the usual things. It's worth looking at his account because it actually comes across as pretty credible. So in other words, yes, there were precedents for this kind of thing. And you don't hear enough about it anymore. And there were some pretty big premonitions, it would seem. The 9/11 that we know today was coming. Now, some of them are kind of a bit esoteric and curious, but we'll mention some of them. I mean, in the world of fiction, and a number of areas like record covers, this is all before 9/11. There had been a mention of the Twin Towers getting hit, the Pentagon there blowing up, and that's a kind of weird card game. And if anybody's seen the X-Files spin-off, The Lone Gunman, this is quite famous now. There is an episode where a plane is heading towards the Twin Towers to bring one of them down, and it's being remote controlled in that episode. Within a year, it really happened. So again, now that was quite a well-viewed TV program. For them all to say, we never imagined that this could happen, doesn't make any sense. Because even in the world of fiction, people have been showing exactly this kind of event occurring. And there's others we could list, even The Simpsons, has weird references to 9/11. We could be here all day. Now, does that mean that record cover designers and TV producers knew what was coming? In my personal view, no. But if you want to get esoteric about it, I think there was a kind of psychic pickup from what was coming. That makes more sense to me. I think there was something in the collective that we all knew was going to be big. And it's worth looking at the experiments that they've done over the last few years, showing that pre-sentiment does seem to work. That actually we do kind of know what's about to come up. And when something's really big, we catch the wave. We won't go any further into that today, but if you read my book Strange, there's a whole section there about 9/11 premonitions. Some of them were really quite uncanny, and I have one of my own, but I won't include that here today, but I do read the book. And people in the financial world had big premonitions, it was seen. So inside trading suddenly starts to do something really weird a few days before 9/11. So the very companies that all got affected in the destruction, especially and particularly at the World Trade Center, it's really weird. Suddenly people started to bet that their stock was going to fall. So in other words, they were putting what's called put options on there. So that's when you lay a bet that that company, that's not going to do so well. Now, why they chose these companies is interesting. So United Airlines and American Airlines were the two airlines that were used in 9/11, right in the official view. Okay. So somebody knew something was about to happen to those companies, and also some of the other companies that were based in the World Trade Center. There was a 1,200% increase in trading activities, saying that these companies' stocks would go short. That's what they were saying. Now that's pretty extraordinary, because nobody had ever done that before with those companies. Why did they think something now was going to affect them? Now, 2.5 million profits were made as the stock fell by 43% on the airline companies after 9/11. Now that's, if you put that in today's money, that doesn't sound a lot now, but that was quite a lot of money back then. So clearly there was something in the ether here. Somebody was putting the word around that something big was about to occur. Now also, another man who had a premonition, Larry Silverstein, or Stein, was the new owner of the World Trade Center, or at least the leaseholder. Nobody had ever taken out a destruction insurance policy on the World Trade Center buildings ever before. Funnily enough, he suddenly thought he should do, just 6 weeks before 9/11. Now maybe it's chance. They can't prove that it isn't. But it's kind of interesting, isn't it? And he did indeed make quite a good financial claim after everything that would soon come. So again, interesting timing. Then other people, like San Francisco's mayor, Willie Brown, he was warned, basically, to be, well, let's get this right, by his airport security to be cautious about air travel on September the 11th. Why? What did they know? And you'll find a lot of other people like this, and these are just two prominent examples where people didn't get on the planes, where people were warned off from flying that day. So clearly the word was going round, right? So you could say it's just psychic waves, but also there were plainly people that knew what was happening. And there were people in the World Trade Center and whatever that didn't turn up that day mysteriously. We're not going to go down that road too much, but clearly the word was out. But it gets weirder. So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, so they're the people that turn up whenever there's a disaster and there's things that need sorting out, right? Mysteriously, they arrived in New York the night before, on the 10th of September, right? And started massing all these forces there as if they were expecting an emergency. Now, that was denied at first, but later on it came out that it was true. So Mayor Rudy Giuliani was mayor at the time as, a controversial figure. He then later had to admit in front of the 9/11 Commission, which was the very inadequate panel that looked at it, but more on that later. He admitted that yes, they were there already. And they were there, he said, for a biochemical attack, right? Drill that was coming on the 12th. Except that nobody can seem to find any references anywhere else to this biochemical drill. So it's really strange timing. So it's almost like, again, they were there, ready for something. Let's have a look at what actually happened then. Now let's establish the facts here, just so we can get the basics. So this is the official version. Well, we know the timings of these are pretty much right. So let's just go through it. 8:15 a.m. So flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles was hijacked. 8:42 a.m. Flight 175 from Boston to Los Angeles hijacked. 8:46 Flight 77 from Washington D.C. to Los Angeles was hijacked. At 8:46 a.m. World Trade Center 1, it's one of the towers, was hit by Flight 11. 9:03 a.m. World Trade Center Tower 2 was hit by Flight 175. Let's keep going. At 9:16 a.m., Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco was hijacked. 9:38 a.m., the Pentagon was then hit by Flight 77. 9:59 a.m., World Trade Center 2 collapses. 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 crashes in woods. We're going to cover all of this. 10:28 a.m., World Trade Center 1 collapses. 5:20 p.m., World Trade Center 7 collapses. And you've just heard a song about that, and we will come to that. And it's extraordinary to me that even today, a lot of people know nothing about Building 7. And yet without understanding the mystery of Building 7, you can't understand really what holds the key to all of this. But don't worry, you don't know, we're going to cover it. So these are the basic established facts, okay? Now let's start to look behind them. Alright, let's have a quick look at the hijackings. These are the actual planes that were hijacked. So these are them when they were in their heyday. We won't go into the fine detail of what kind of planes they were, but in essence, 767 impacted World Trade Center 1, another 767 impacted World Trade Center 2, 757 hit the Pentagon, well, we'll see, and another 757 crashed in the woods of Pennsylvania. Okay. Immediately, though, you start to look at the hijackers, the whole thing starts to go wrong. I mean, that's the official map that you will be shown as to the hijacks and where the planes then went off course and it all went wiggly, iggly, biggly. Let's not get too much into that. There's controversy about where they really went and whether these are the true trajectories. And it's one of the things that's never truly been settled. But anyway, they were hijacked and then they started to head for their targets. Okay. The hijackers themselves, their identities, right, we apparently know, even though there's many mysteries about which of them really got on the planes. The CCTV that we have been shown is very inconsistent. And even on a single shot, the time coding is wrong. The time is different from one panel to another. That's never been explained. So some of the faces that we see do look a bit like the hijackers, we were told. Others seem to bear no resemblance to them whatsoever. There's a big mystery here about exactly who was on these planes. So, quite incredibly, to this day, no definitive passenger list has ever been agreed for the hijacked planes. So, you'd think, wouldn't you, they'd know who was on their planes that day. Well, if they do, they're not telling. What that means is we cannot be entirely sure who was a hijacker and who wasn't, because allegedly false IDs were used by the hijackers, but they've never told us what the false IDs on the passenger lists actually were. So we don't know who's real and who's fake in the lists that have been released. You'd think they want to get that really clear, but no, even the basics there are very mysterious. And then you look at how many people got on board these flights, and it gets even stranger. So the passenger list for all four of the planes was very low that day. I mean, unusually low. I mean, Flight 93 was only at 19% capacity. So you can't read that. That's just 45 people on board a plane that seated 239. This is quite a busy commuter flight. Well, that's kind of odd, and we'll kind of echo back to that in a minute. Because if you see this as a setup, there might be reasons why that was the case, if that is a correct figure. And this is kind of minor, but just worth a brief mention. After Flight 93 crashed, or whatever happened to it, there were no relatives of the 9 local inhabitants, right, who were allegedly on Flight 93 waiting at San Francisco. So normally there would be somebody waiting to pick somebody up or waiting for news. There wasn't anybody there. Now maybe that's just chance, but it's kind of odd, almost like nobody was expecting those people ever to get off at the other end. So you're a hijackers. Well, you saw in Martin's song, you know, there have been a lot of claims that some of them still live today. A couple of them have said, it's me, I'm here. And of course, nobody wants to believe that. And then the West says, no, they're just lies. So there's huge mysteries. Some of them we do know were involved. Mohammed Atta was a big one, and there was an alleged mastermind behind this, but we'll come to him a little bit later on. And the other one that we'll mention is Henny Hanjour, who manages to do something quite impressive, allegedly, but we'll see about him soon. But as we don't properly know who was on the planes or what false IDs they were using, it's mystery. And there's one thing that tells us who these people were that we'll come to in a minute. Some of you might already know, and you'll have a chuckle about it. But it's not very troublesome, because how they apparently did it, we are told, was using these little box cutters or Stanley knives, as we might call them here. So they smuggled them on board and allegedly did attack people and then held, people at bay and plane staff, enabling them to hijack the planes. Now, how they got through security doors and things like this, there's a lot of arguments about that. We do not know. But the only proper source we've got on this, really, is a phone call that apparently was made by Barbara Olson. She was on Flight 77 that would apparently hit the Pentagon. She was a well-known newsreader. She was named for CNN. She was married to the then US Solicitor General, Ted Olson. Now, Ted Olson claimed that when she was on the hijacked plane, she managed to make 2 calls to him and talk to him and told him what was going on and said that the guys with the box cutters, they pushed everybody up one end of the plane and they're going to do something terrible. And it's really her testimony that tells us much about this. The rest of the phone calls we'll see in a minute are very vague. But here's the weird thing. When the phone company was then approached by the 9/11 Commission for the phone records, they had no record of any call going through from her phone. There was an attempt to call Ted, but it didn't go through. So who was Ted Olson talking to? Now, is he lying for some weird reason? And we don't think he is. Or, and today you would take this for granted with AI, had somebody already perfected some kind of voice synthesizer back then that made it sound like her? And they say, don't they, most technology that we get today has usually been around in secret for about 25 years, which would be about right for this. So there's massive mysteries about that. This is a cartoon at the time, just as mobile phones were being introduced onto planes. Now, we take it for granted now that you can use them in many places, including flights. Back then, that was mostly not the case. You can see here somebody here being not very happy about everybody being on their phones. So very few of the 9/11 phone recordings have ever been publicly released. There's a handful that have, and you might have heard them played in various TV programs. Now, it's really interesting though, because especially a guy called A.K. Dewdney, who was, very much a radio ham and wanted to know how they got these signals through. He flew phones at various altitudes and discovered that you could not back then have got a mobile phone to work above 8,000 feet back in 2001. You could not get one to work. Now, granted, when the planes then came in over New York, they were a lot lower. It's not impossible. Some calls could have been made by then. However, that doesn't explain Flight 93 that was flying just below 40,000 feet. And nobody knows to this day exactly how those calls were made. Now, then there were claims, well, they weren't using mobile phones or cell phones, as they would call them there. They were using seat-back phones. Now, they were just being introduced, so if you were like an executive, you could make a call, and then it presumably would use the aeroplane antenna, Well, the problem with that is Flight 77 that Barbara Olson was on was definitively identified as not having seat-back phones. So she definitely did. Flight 93, some people in the industry have said they did, others have said no, it didn't. So again, even there, the basics, you would think they would know what was installed in these flights. We've never really got to know. And some of the calls are weird now. Some of you might know this one. This is a man called Mark Bingham with his mother there. Now, Mark Bingham, we have heard his call, and he makes a call to his mum from one of the hijacked planes to say basically probably goodbye. And when she picks up the phone, he says, "Hi Mum, this is Mark Bingham." Now, I mean, that's like me saying, "Mum, it's Andy Thomas here, I'm about to die." Apparently, his family say, "Oh no, he always called himself Mark Bingham, and he always used his surname." But others think that's just some desperate cover-up. I mean, we don't know, but it's kind of weird, and then his tone and what it's just weird. All the calls are weird. So there is a possibility that some of these calls were in some way faked. We don't know that. And all I can do is, again, share with you the mysteries and anomalies here, and it's worth looking up some of this, because there's probably more we should know. Now, what is interesting, though, given the various sort of doubts about what was on which plane, was that they cannot even tell us the truth, it would seem, about what we might today call the black boxes on the planes. And this is kind of crucial. So officially, the flight data recorders, that's not voice recordings, but that's data about the flight, telemetry, things like that. So the ones from Flight 11, 175 and 93 were never found, presumed destroyed. Now, bearing in mind the whole point of a black box is that they are meant to survive quite a lot. And isn't it weird that 3 of them did not survive? Okay. But ground zero workers that came in and did the rescue and the clear up said they did find them. So you will find people saying, yeah, I did. But then the authorities say, oh, we never saw them. Now make of that what you will. But something did survive, and that was the hijackers' passports, which from balls of flame fluttered down onto the streets below. So we were able to go, oh, it was him, and it was him. This is a fairy tale. It is so unlikely that this could have happened when nobody else's passports apparently survived these huge explosions. But isn't it convenient? And it helped identify them. And then you discover that both recorders, interestingly, for Flight 77, were found at the Pentagon. Now that's the plane, as we'll see in a minute, that has the biggest dispute about what really hit the Pentagon. So the one with the biggest dispute, funnily enough, they've got both the data recorder and the voice recorders for that. To tell you, yes, this was the plane. The others, oh, don't worry about that. And only the voice recorder was found for Flight 93, which again is kind of quite convenient, because again, there's huge controversy about what really happened to Flight 93, as we are about to discover. Now there's a mystery of the transponder. So a transponder is basically an automatic beacon signal that planes give out. Now, until this day, in nearly all previous hijacks, nobody had ever thought to turn off the transponders. Okay. On 9/11, all the signal, they were turned off. Okay. So that's one of the main reasons why we were told that they weren't able to track the planes once they'd been hijacked. But even that makes no sense. So NORAD is the North American Aerospace Defense Command. Now they claim, even with the information they were putting out in 2001, that they could track a bird, just using normal radar. Why did they need the transponders to be on to track those planes if they could track a bird, which generally doesn't have a transponder? And one of the best of the 9/11 researchers, sadly no longer with us, is David Ray Griffin. We'll be saying more about soon. And I'll quote you what he said. The most important falsehood is the claim that the US military cannot track airplanes that are not sending out a transponder signal. The military still has its traditional primary radar, which does not depend upon anything being sent from the aircraft. If aircraft not sending out transponder signals were invisible to the military radars, then Soviet bombers coming to attack the US during the Cold War could have avoided detection by simply turning their transponders off. So this claim that that's why they couldn't track the planes is plainly untrue, if you pardon the pun. Let's carry on. And then you discover that a strange exercise, maybe like the FEMA exercise, was going on 9/11, called Operation Vigilant Guardian. Would you believe? Which imagined precisely aeroplane attacks on all the targets that really then got used that day. Now you can look at this two ways. That either that somebody set that up knowing, and then they'll think it's all just a test and we'll really do it, or somebody else found out they were doing this and used that day to kind of muddy the waters. And it did muddy the waters. You'll hear air traffic controllers saying, when the hijacks are being reported, they're saying, is this real world or exercise? They don't know. And that caused confusion. And that is, again, that's kind of an excuse used to say that's why the authorities couldn't respond quickly enough. But it is an excuse, and we'll see in a minute how some of the top level people must have known what was going on at the very moments that these were happening. And you'll see why, even though they claimed it wasn't true. So the transcripts of the NORAD air traffic control tapes, by the way, and the tapes themselves, have been reissued over the years in an edited form. So we have the original transcripts, which were very damning because it made it clear that they did know, way before they say they did, when these aeroplanes had been hijacked or where they were going, and then they re-edited them and reissued them, and then managed to slowly delete the old ones, even though people have still got copies. It's that blatant, realising that the real transcripts were too damning. They actually just reissued new ones. So, oh no, ignore those ones. These are the real ones, which of course make them look a little bit better. The whole thing does look like some kind of stand-down order was in operation. In other words, they wanted to let these planes go to wherever they were going. Let's carry on. Now, normal procedure in any hijack is to send out fighters to escort the plane down or see what's going on. That did not happen on 9/11. And again, because they say, well, we didn't know where they were, but we now know, of course, they did know where they were. They must have done. When they did finally scramble some jets, they flew them at about half speed and apparently sent them in the wrong direction. Oh dear. So the whole thing is clearly a mess, but it does seem to be more than that. So they made a show of sending up fighter escorts, and then, of course, didn't really do anything useful with that. So, these people have a lot to answer for. Dick Cheney was then the Vice President. Donald Rumsfeld was the Defense Secretary, or whatever he was. And General Richard Myers was a very important part of the military. Now, they all claimed that they were not in station in time to stop anything or give orders. And they said, we got in late, we didn't know what was going on, it was all confusion, and by the time we got there, it was all over. Even though that testimony is directly contradicted by their own staff. Do have a read one day of this book, Against All Enemies, by Richard Clarke, who was the White House security chief. Now, it's not a debunk of 9/11, right? He's all for the official story, except, without realising it, he lands all those three people that we just saw there, right, in the ship, basically. Because he says, oh yes, and Cheney was here, and I spoke to Rumsfeld at this time, and absolutely makes it clear they were there and knew exactly what was going on. And if you want something that is deliciously upsetting and yet fascinating all at the same time, read the testimony of Norman Mineta. Now, he was the US Transport Secretary at this stage. Now, he testified to the 9/11 Commission, and again, is a supporter of the official story, but clearly didn't know what the lies were meant to be, and without realising it, says something really damning. So he claims he was present in one of the control rooms, in the bunkers, whatever you want to call them, with Dick Cheney. And he said this in front of the 9/11 Commission. It's all on film, it's all recorded, and I'll read you exactly what he's saying. Because he basically seems to suggest that they were allowing the plane to come in and hit the Pentagon and deliberately didn't stop it. Here is precisely what he has to say. And he said, well, during the time that the airplane was coming into the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the Vice President, the plane is 50 miles out. The plane is 30 miles out. And when he got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? And then bang, and it hit the Pentagon. Now, it does sound, doesn't it? There's almost no other way to interpret that other than that he was present when they were allowing the plane to come in. But that directly contradicts everything that Cheney says, who said he wasn't there. Now, guess what? They didn't include this testimony in the final 9/11 Commission report. I wonder why. And you will find a few other very damning things that were all found, all in front of the Commission, and never made it into the final report. Any of that was excised and thrown in the bin. But you can still, if you know where to look, and by the way, it's getting ever harder to find this stuff online now, and even just re-putting this talk back together today, I discovered a lot of 9/11 material is vanishing. It's getting really hard to find. Get to it while you still can, because this is being taken away in favour of the fairy tale version that the world is fed. And then we get this chap. Now, George W. Bush has been accused of some as being an architect of 9/11. Now, this is only a personal opinion, but I don't think that he was. And I think there's good reasons to doubt that, except he got dragged in, I think. So he was reading a book, in fact, about a goat, I believe, to children in a school. And this was televised. They told the world where he was, and they'd shown us. And then, as he's sitting there in front of the kids, his secretary, Andrew Card, back then, comes in, and he whispers in his ear, we now know, he said, "Sir, America is under attack." And you look at the face of Bush, he doesn't know what's going on. It's clear to me, he's not fronting that up. He's utterly bewildered. He doesn't know how to deal with the situation. There was a problem with George W. Bush all round. Good golfer, but dealing with things like this. And instead of getting up immediately and saying, there's been a tragedy, I need to go back, and also, by the way, if I stay here, the school's going to be in danger, because he now knew that planes were flying around hitting targets, okay? He didn't. He sat there and carried on reading the story, even though the TV had just broadcast where the president was. So clearly, somebody in the know knew there wasn't a plane heading his way. I don't think he knew what was going on. Now, there's a lot of interesting things about what happened that day. They packed him onto Air Force One, which is the presidential airplane, of course, and just flew him around all day. Now, there are claims that they now deny, but at the time it was quite widely discussed, that there were coded warnings sent to the plane saying Angel is next. Now, Angel is the code word for Air Force One. And there is a theory, and it's all it can be for tonight, that the president then got a call, probably from Cheney or maybe Rumsfeld, whoever might have been involved with all of this, saying, Mr. President, here's what's really going on today. And then they explained, and they said, are you with us, sir? Or your plane might not make it back today. You can imagine that happening, can't you? And there is then a complete change by the evening when Bush gives his speech, where he describes this day as the new Pearl Harbor, very famously, which of course is interesting, because a lot of people think Pearl Harbor was a complete setup too. We'll say a little bit about that later on. And then it seems clear he's on board, he knows what's going on, and then he fronts it up. In my personal view, the view of people like Lady Ray Griffin, I don't think he knew, not when it was happening. You wouldn't want to entrust him with that, would you? Because he might say, I'll do something stupid. So I think later he got pulled in. Okay, what about Flight 93? Now this is one of the oddest things really about 9/11. So this is the plane that didn't crash into anything. The idea was it probably was going to hit the White House. Allegedly. We don't know that, and it never got there. There's been at least 2 Hollywood movies made about this, so it's gone into fiction now. And it's all about the heroics of the people on board the craft, because they apparently all managed to get up, and they fought down the terrorists, and they got into the cockpit, and they were grappling with them, and in the fight the plane came down and hit the woods. Okay, so it's a good story. Is it true? Probably not. We've already seen that there's huge doubts about the phone calls made allegedly from 93, because it was at an altitude where there is simply no way those calls could have been made. One oddity, I can't prove anything here, but I must share this with you. So WCPO TV in America reported, because all the planes now have been landed, and everyone knew what was going on, and they stopped all the flights, didn't they? They reported that Flight 93 had actually landed safely at Cleveland Hopkins Airport in Ohio. Now this has later on been denied, so yes, they did announce that, but they then said, oh no, we got it wrong, it was another plane, it wasn't Flight 93. But do you remember we were saying that the planes that were involved had very few passengers on board them? Do you remember that? And Flight 93 was only at 19% capacity that day. There is a theory that actually it did land there, and then the plane that we all believe, or were told to believe, hit the Pentagon, right, also landed quietly, and they took the people off the plane that was going to hit the Pentagon, put them onto Flight 93, said they were all going to take them home now safely, and then blew them up over the woods to get rid of all the people who might have been a bit awkward if it turns out they weren't on a plane that hit the Pentagon. So you had to get rid of them, didn't you? Now, it's only a theory. You can understand why some think there might be something to this. Unless, yes, all right, they didn't really land there. But I just passed that on to you, because there's a lot of weirdness about what really hit the Pentagon. That's a shot, if you pardon again, another pun, of Flight 93 crashing in Pennsylvania. Now, some interesting things here. I mean, number one, there's a large number of witnesses who claim that they saw it explode in the air, and there's a lot of people that believe that this craft was shot down, probably by the US, and probably not unreasonably. But it doesn't look good, does it? It's not very patriotic to shoot down a plane full of your own people. But if they thought it was headed for the White House, there probably was a case they could have made that they needed to stop it, maybe. The debris field was about 8 miles wide. But we're told the whole plane came down in one go because the people, the passengers on board, were grappling with the hijacks. Now, let's just compare that to a shot of ordnance going off in Afghanistan. And it kind of begins to look a little bit different than what you get in an air crash. And this is an air crash in Chicago in 1979. A lot of black smoke, a lot of oil, a lot of fuel. It goes on for quite a while. It does seem that what came down with Flight 93 didn't really do a lot. And then you actually begin to look at the debris field. This is an airliner that hit Ukraine, not part of the war, that crashed some years ago. It shows what you'd imagine, the engines, big bits of wing, fuselage, you'd imagine that. Now let's have a look at the impact side of Flight 93. It's literally nothing. It's a crate with a few little bits and blackened stuff there. This doesn't make sense. If that whole plane came down, by the way, this is what they say happened. Came straight down and dug itself into the ground. And all the bits were under the ground, and that's why you can't see them. This makes zero sense, right? It is clear when you look at the accounts and you look at the evidence of the debris field across 8 miles, this plane was shot down in the air, and then the final bit of it came down here. So the whole story of Flight 93 that is put out there in Hollywood, it is indeed a fiction. Okay. So, what about the Pentagon then? So, here we are, very famous building, of course. Let's have a look at what we're told happened. So, the 757 came in, Flight 77, it hit there, and it went through a few of the rings, what they call the rings here. You'll see them in a minute. In fact, we have a look here. That's the trajectory it took to come in. So, you can see here the Pentagon's made up of blocks there that have got open courtyards in between them. So, this is what we're told. It came across there. The plane apparently clipped some light poles. We'll see that in a minute. And then it came and hit there. Now, here's something really interesting, right? Somebody found this aerial shot taken of the Pentagon some weeks before 9/11 occurred, where exactly the path that it would take to hit the Pentagon, it's like somebody scraped something across the lawn there, almost like it's an arrow saying, hit here. It's just kind of weird that then that is exactly where Flight 77 then hits. Now, maybe it's a coincidence, but, well, look it up. This is how we're told the plane came in. So we'll see in a minute, it turned this incredible curve, apparently, at 530 miles per hour, at lawn skimming height, without ever once clipping anything and suddenly cartwheeling. But this is what we're told, and it came in and it hit the Pentagon. Now, really? Probably not. Here are the light poles. Now, one thing worth saying, a few people that witnessed this said it was kind of weird, it's like they'd just been unbolted from the ground and thrown on the road. Now, maybe that's just an expression they're using, but it's possible something hit the light poles. Was it Flight 77 though? We know from the eyewitnesses that a big plane did come down low over the Pentagon. But a lot of people say, yeah, but that kept going, and then something smaller came in underneath it, and then hit the Pentagon. This is where it starts to get confusing. So this is the trajectory, we're told, this is official, at least, the plane came. So to get down to that long skimming height, it came in and it turned this very, very tight turn there, And we can see here the final moments of it, according to what they tell us. Now, there is an organisation, or was anyway, called Pilots for 9/11 Truth. The website's still visible, I'll give it to you later on, where many pilots have just said there is simply no way that a plane of that nature could have performed that manoeuvre without just breaking up in the air. Not at the speed that we are told. What's strange here is that, okay, let's imagine you're a hijacker and you want to take out an awful lot of the Pentagon, yeah? Why don't you just hit for the giant bullseye? Take out half the block, you know? But oh no, it goes out of its way to hit the one block of the Pentagon that was under renovation at that time and didn't have many people in it, weirdly. Almost like restricted carnage was wanted here, maximum at the World Trade Center. And that sounds cynical, but then you read that the person flying the plane was Hani Hanjour, we mentioned earlier on, who, even the flight school in America that accidentally trained him up said he could not handle basic air maneuvers. He was widely described as the worst pilot they'd ever had. But on 9/11, somehow he managed to perform one of the most extraordinary feats of aviation acrobatics in history. Make of that what you will. So let's have a look at the damage. Now, these are cable spools, they're not wheels of the plane, these were already there. They were doing work at the Pentagon, okay? Note that they are not damaged. The restricted damage at the Pentagon is very weird. So you see some debris. A number of witnesses said at the time there weren't any bodies lying around, there wasn't any luggage, minimal debris. I mean, a couple of people, and again, you try and find this now, and you'll struggle, but it's preserved out there. Because it's like somebody come along, just thrown a bit on the grass there. It didn't seem to relate to the other debris that was in the building, but okay. So this has a wingspan of 124.7 feet. Okay, now there you see they've shown it with the collapse that occurred afterwards, but actually, initially, that's what the impact zone looks like. So there's the cable spools. So a wingspan of 124 foot basically got into an area we're told officially was about 20 feet across. So the whole plane apparently went in there. Now notice something. Either side, you've still got walls, apparently a window there. What happened to the wings? When this was questioned, they thought about this for a while, and one report even said, oh, well, the wings, they vaporized. Wow. So that means basically turning into thin air. Here's a diagram that they showed, right? So the wings just kind of fell apart like cardboard, and that's why it didn't take out the supports. But if that's true, where are the wing bits? Why aren't they all over the lawn? And yet there seems to be very minimal debris there. It's very strange. This is an interesting picture. Now, so this is after the walls collapsed. So initially, whatever went in there, right, you see a burst of flame. I'll show you the picture in a minute. But it wasn't a massive burst of flame like we see at the Twin Towers. It seemed to burn out very quickly. And look, so when it entered, it would be down here somewhere. But you'd imagine, like the Twin Towers, wouldn't you? Fires raging. That's how they justify why the towers came down. But apparently no fires were raging. And even a book on the stall is sitting there not even singed by the look of it. Which suggests quite a surgical strike going into the Pentagon here, rather than a huge aircraft. So we can see what happened. So it entered there, and it managed to get through a few of the rings, so it went through a couple of the blocks there, and that's what they call the punch-out zone. So that was the final bit. There's a bit of debris and stuff, but it's odd. And there's no seats, there's no kind of very visible bits of a giant airplane in any of the footage we've seen. So then people started to look at this. So the people that said they saw something small hit the Pentagon, they wonder, was it a drone? And these are early drones, not what we got today. So back then they had things like Global Hawk, Tomahawk cruise missiles. There's been a lot of debate about this. What actually hit the Pentagon? I'm not sure that it was one of these, because I think there's a more convincing case to be made that it was a small airplane, but we'll see in a minute. Now, this is real CCTV of the Pentagon about to be struck, and then you'll see it being struck in a minute. Now bear this in mind. On the day of 9/11, and the most surveyed building surely in America, with security cameras everywhere, and there were shops, and there were garages all around it, security agents came out, and they came into all the shops and garages and demanded the CCTV tapes, and really threatening, you give us your tapes now. And given how much doubt there is about what hit the Pentagon, you would think, wouldn't you, they would have released really clear footage, yeah? They never have. They must have it. So, spot the plane. Anybody see the plane there? No? Okay, apparently that's it just there. We'll see it sink in a minute. So that's the plane coming in there, and then bang. Now, that's all they've ever released. I think there's a couple of other bits from a very long distance away. It's not helpful. They could put this argument to bed tomorrow if they so chose. Apparently they don't want to. Now, some of you may know Jack White. He's dead now. Now, okay, believe what you will, but he's examined many of the NASA pictures and said some of these alleged lunar pictures clearly aren't real, and you've got to believe what you want to believe. But some of the observations he makes are very good. So Jack White looked at 9/11, so that's a close-up of the plane. Can you see it? Only just. And he says it's clearly not that, it's not 757. And out of all the planes he could find to match it, he thought it was that, an A3 Sky Warrior. And interestingly, one of the window panels, by accident or design, does seem to look very like the shape of the window panels in the A3 Sky Warrior. It's quite a sort of an unusual plane. It wasn't used that much. It was used mainly for training. But it might have been enough to do the damage they wanted at the Pentagon. So, look, that does, I have to say, look a lot more like that than a 757, would you agree? And seemingly you can see exhaust coming up the back there. So there's huge doubt about what happened to the Pentagon plane. So we've already mentioned that, because then you've got to say, okay, if Flight 77 didn't hit, what happened to Flight 77? So I've given you one possible theory. And even if that's not what happened, the real plane must have been taken away somewhere and either broken up or, relisted in some way. There's more to know, but we don't have the time. Okay, so the most emblematic part of 9/11 are, of course, the towers. And I believe that they were intended to be. This was clearly a shock and awe exercise. Now, you could say that even if it was bin Laden. But if you were, say, a New World Order operative that wanted to shock the world and put the world into fear so that you would then all do whatever they wanted you to do, this was a brilliant thing to use. Everybody knows the Twin Towers. It's, the symbols of trade and commerce and Western money. So to see them like this, that's a big wound in the West Tower, clearly. But this, as we know, is where it gets even stickier. So let's have a look at the towers. So, World Trade Center 2 was hit at basically 2 minutes past 9, or 0.59, so 3 minutes past 9. It collapsed after 56 minutes, so it came in between the 85th and the 77th floor there. World Trade Center 1, curiously, was hit earlier at 8:46. And it collapsed after 102 minutes, so one actually stood for a bit longer, and that was hit between the 93rd and the 99th floor. What's kind of interesting though is, okay, you could say they trained the pilots really well here, but as we saw with Henny Hensure, maybe not, they both managed to go in at almost exactly the same angle. And some have argued that remote control could have been used here. Even if there were hijackers on board, somebody then somehow took control and were making sure these were precision hits. I mean, we're never going to know. But it's kind of interesting, isn't it? There's very, very similar angle they've got in on that. You might have seen that there's very little footage of the first impact. There's a few security camera ones. The most famous footage was taken by the French Naudet brothers. They were filming a documentary in the streets of New York. And while they're filming the firemen at work, and you look it up, and it's still a shocking bit of footage. Suddenly the plane goes over, and they all look back, and wham, it hits the tower. Now look, I know that there are people that have argued there weren't any planes and that they were all holograms. If you believe that, that is your view. I don't share that view personally, because having looked at this, it's very clear to me that there was physical object there, or physical objects. And also, what the hologram theory overlooks is, people watch these, and you can see the film flying over the city, and lots of people witnessed it. I've met many independent witnesses to that over the years. You've got the sound of the planes. You'd have to have a hologram that was in one little bubble, making the sound of an aeroplane to come in. You know what? Why not just get a plane and hit the Pentagon and hit the Twin Towers? It's a lot easier than using hologram technology that might fail and suddenly fizzle out halfway through the project. You know what I mean? So I can't say that didn't happen. I'm not going down that road today. And the whole hologram theory was widely used, I must tell you, to bring the whole 9/11 truth movement into disrepute, and fairly successfully. Even if it was true, it just doesn't sound good. So I'm not going to go down that road today. Let's have a look at the sequence here. Now, a few interesting things. So you'll see the sequence is slowly going in, or very quickly. Just before the impact, and this has never been resolved, what this is, there's a flash of light. Now, let's have a look at this a bit more clearly. Is it some electromagnetic thing? Is it just the beacon lights of the plane suddenly shining on the glass of the tower? We don't know. But you see this, and all the impacts, there's some bright flash. It's almost before it even touches. We have never worked out what these are. Now, I don't know if this is a real piece of footage, but I have seen it on official websites showing the first moment of impact. And I find this is interesting. Because look, the nose is barely even in, there's a flash, and already there's an explosion in the building there. Assuming this isn't a fake image, I have never seen this explained anywhere. Because it's almost like something's been trying to go off at the very second of the impact of that plane. Okay? Or the plane's fired something into the building just as it got there. Now that sounds ridiculous, I know. It sounds like science fiction, but it's kind of weird. So 9:03 a.m., flight 175 then hits World Trade Center 2. This, in a way, was the more shocking moment. Because don't forget, the first one, everybody went, oh my God, a terrible accident. When you see the next one coming in, you know, and you pit your stomach, shit, this is an attack. Right? Whether you think it was Bin Laden or the New World Order, right? It's an attack. So you know we're all in trouble at that point. And you know, you can understand the sinking feeling in people's stomachs when this thing happened. But equally mysterious. Now, we've got better footage of this because suddenly all the cameras were trained now on the World Trade Center. There's been a lot of debate about what you see underneath the planes here, these weird pods. Now, are they pods, or is it just a reflection on the fuselage? This is something that caused great debate now you never really hear about, but it might be important because maybe these were not conventional planes and they were packed with explosives or something to make damn sure maximum damage occurred at the Twin Towers. So that's the plane that hit Tower 2, that's a normal Boeing. Well, in your own minds, it could be reflection, but it's worth looking up. And I'm leaving you, I know, with a lot of unresolved things here. But you need to go and do the reading and look it up while you still can, before all this vanishes out of public circulation. And then you notice something really interesting, and again, we've got more footage of the second impact. I know this is horrible, by the way, because whatever you think caused this, there's people dying here, right? So I'm not belittling or trivialising that, but we're going to look forensically at this today, because of the implications for life that's come ever since. What do you notice? That there are huge explosions of jet fuel igniting almost immediately, and then very, very quickly it turns to a very black smoke, which actually, relatively speaking, is a very low temperature fire. And that matters because, of course, the argument is that the fires were what brought the towers down, right, from the impacts. But actually, you can see in all this footage that the majority of jet fuel that you were told lashed down lift shafts and set light to the whole buildings, right? Actually, most of it burnt out in the initial impact. And that is why you see so much black smoke. It's what they would call a low temperature fire. Now, you wouldn't want to be near it, okay, obviously, but this is important. And you get these heartbreaking images of the people just standing looking forlorn down. And as you know, some decided just to let themselves go and they jump. I'm not going to look at that. However, it tells us something. Clearly some people were terribly burned and horribly injured, no getting away from that. But others were managing to stand there for quite a while, not being immediately burned. So in other words, there were some places where, yes, there was impact damage, but there was not jet fuel still burning everywhere. And that is so important, because we are told that is what effectively pulverised the towers. And that word I use specifically for reasons you will see in a minute. And then they collapse, or do they collapse? Collapse is a word that has, shall we say, certain connotations. Many prefer the word fall, some would say explode. The examination of the footage of these towers coming down is something that everybody needs to do and spend quite a lot of time looking at it, even though it's harrowing. This is the official reason for why the towers collapse, and they can't quite decide. They either call it total collapse, or global collapse, or they call it pancaking. We're not going to get into the ins and outs of this, but basically, they say that once the floor was damaged by the impact, or a couple of floors, right, then all the supports were weakened, and the weight of the top of the tower acted as a pile driver. And that's when, in the end, everything gave way, and it was like a big wave coming down. Except none of that is supported by what we see in the actual footage, because it is plain that the tops of the towers are just disintegrating into nothing. There is no weight there of any pile driver nature to actually do that. And then they're very deceptive when they show you how the towers were made. They kind of show you these floors sliding up and down these bars like nothing was holding them on. But that is, of course, not true. Here's the World Trade Center being constructed. So we had 47 central core supports, 240 perimeter or exterior columns. Now, the argument is they were so damaged by the impacts that they just couldn't hold the buildings up anymore. And yet, right, it's really worth checking out what one of the 9/11 Commission scientists himself actually said. And he said the number of columns lost on the initial impact was not large, and the loads were shifted to remaining columns. So he's saying that actually, in his view, Thomas Eager, right, that could not account for the collapse. But when it turned out that actually he was being inconvenient, he got buried and everybody forgot that he ever said that. But actually, there were more than enough supports going, still there, where they should not have collapsed, inverted commas. Jet fuel, let's have a brief chat about this. There is something that people kind of chuckle at now. So, oh no, you talk about jet fuel like you know it, but it's not that hard to find out. So jet fuel is basically kerosene, and it can briefly burn up to temperatures of about 1800 Fahrenheit. So let's do it in American Fahrenheit. Well, steel begins to weaken at around 2800 Fahrenheit. So there's a big leap there, because we're told the steel supports was so heated up by the jet fuel fires that again they snapped and suddenly all down it came. This is interesting. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, who were the key, basically government panel that was trying to find out why the collapses occurred, they claimed that vital fireproofing was removed from the steel supports by the plane's impact. Or planes, okay. But do you know how they actually worked that out? Right? They're really scientific method for showing how that might have happened. Yes, it was by firing shotgun rounds and steel plates in a plywood box. That's how good their science is. And they did a few of them, so there you go, that's how it happened at the World Trade Center. Anyway, let's move on now. It's pathetic. Utterly pathetic. That is not science. That is a distortion of science. And so many writers on this have pointed out. But, so, okay, they say, oh, the fireproofing was removed and down they came. Well, there's another possibility. And Francis and Julie Wood, don't worry, I'm coming to her in a minute. It was then pointed out that there are substances that can make things burn brighter and hotter. And one of them is nanothermite, or thermate. There's a lot of kind of variations on this. It's used in demolitions. Okay. This is where it starts to get interesting on that sense. There were several people involved with this, but the big leading ones were Dr. Niels Harrit, Professor Stephen Jones, who lost his job at university as a lecturer because he dared to say it is very clear that demolition techniques were used at the Twin Towers. They examined the dust flecks that were left over from the wreckage and discovered what they claim are nanothermitic particles. Now these guys are qualified scientists, right? The official people said, no, it's paint, it's remains of paint. Well, anybody that knows anything about this knows that cannot be paint. But okay, there are therefore people that say there are demolition techniques that could explain some of the higher temperatures that surely must have been involved here. But then, and this is where I was very annoyed at the time, I still am, Dr. Julie Wood came along. She's a very interesting person. She wrote a book called Where Did the Towers Go? Now she's more alternative in the way she thinks, and she thought some kind of high energy technology or even mini nukes might have been used to bring the towers down. Now, it's interesting, and there are certainly some anomalies that are not fully explained by nanothermate. But what happened in the 9/11 truth world was, in the way this often happens, read my book, The New Heretics, for the story on this. Those people that believed in Julie Wood, because she's an alternative, so she must be right, then attacked Jones and Harrit, saying they're working for the other side. They want you for some weird reason to believe in nanothermite. We know it was secret technology, which we can't actually tell you what it was, but we know it was. And it wound up in this ridiculous argument where actually they just could have agreed that whatever technology was used, something brought the towers down, you know? But no. Instead, it wound up with a massive polarisation that split the 9/11 truth movement, and by the way, fatally undermined it. And that's stupid. There's a lesson there. But yes, you can disagree with someone, that's fine. You have an opinion, you don't have to say you're working for the other side. It's pathetic. Stop it. I'm not saying you're doing it, but for those people out there might listen to the recording of this later. And then you see footage of what we're told is molten metal from some sources rolling down the sides of the towers. Now we've already seen there is simply no way the official temperatures could have burned anything like this or produced that unless something had been introduced. And it does begin to look a bit like that picture we just saw of nanothermite. It is also noticeable that after the falls, in the days after and the months after, you're seeing footage of glowing, red hot, molten stuff being dug up. And yet, think about that. Most of the towers were not on fire. So they were the central fire zones. Then, according to the official view, they pancake down, they all collapsed. So they should in effect just be a load of rubble with a few hot bits. But they kept finding masses of amounts of something very, very molten. And even months later, when they did satellite thermal imaging of the site, it's still glowing, incredible temperatures. And that is not typical of a fire. It would be certainly more typical of something else that had been introduced there. Now, you see the towers come down, but again, what do you notice? Because they say these are collapses. Does that look like it's collapsing? That is exploding. And bear in mind, a lot of the debris flew so far away, they were finding human remains and bits of the Twin Towers nearly a mile away. That's how far this stuff was thrown out. Right? And they were finding it even years later. Bits of fingers up on rooftops and stuff from these buildings. That's not a collapse. And a lot of people have examined the footage and said it's almost like the clouds of smoke you see are pyroclastic, so like you get in volcanoes, they're heat sort of like propelled. And when you see everybody being chased through the streets by the clouds, well, yeah, you're going to get big clouds of dust. But a lot of people said it was like red hot. It was like more heat than you would imagine. It felt like a volcano. That again would strongly suggest there might have been an element here of something that was introduced that was not just a collapse. By the way, I was trying to find some really good photographs of people escaping the pyroclastic clouds in the streets, and whereas you used to be able to find them, I can hardly find any now. So again, the story of 9/11 online is slowly being withheld from the public. Check it out. These were not collapses, and we mentioned pulverization earlier on, right? These buildings were turned to dust. And you read the accounts of the rescue workers and the people that were mopping this up, right? And you can go look this up, it's in some of my books, and they say it's really weird. There weren't any filing cabinets, or telephones, or carpets. It should be there, right? Because only some of those floors were on fire. All of the stuff that was in an office block, those massive fires, should all be there in a huge pile at the bottom, and it was gone. It was literally turned to dust. These buildings were clearly destroyed by something other than a collapse. And then the poor people of New York had to breathe this in. And you may know some are still dying from it today. It was toxic, and there might be more in that dust than we knew. And the firemen and rescue workers gave a lot to help other people and died for it because of what they ingested. And then you get the classics, the demolition squids, question mark. Now again, whether you think it's Judy Wood technology or whether you think it's more conventional demolition technology, there's a lot of footage showing explosions going off that are far below the collapse levels, if you want to call it that, at the top. Now bear this in mind. The towers were coming down at effectively, and I know there's been arguments about this, free fall speed. And there is certainly an admission with one of the buildings that for a few seconds it was coming down at free fall. That means as fast as anything can fall in gravity, okay? That means some of the explosions you're about to see have nothing to do with what's going on at the top. That is a demolition of a flat block of flats in Philadelphia. And you can see here, there's something that looks very like this. So these explosions are completely divorced from what's going on up there. There's a lot of footage, or was, when you could look at all of it, showing explosions going off. And you see little runs of like crackles, which is very indicative of the building, the buildings you see on the TV you're being to watch. So there's a lot of evidence of this, there's a lot of verbal descriptions of this, but you're not allowed to hear it anymore. Watch this, it's not nice, but watch it. Right, you can see what's being highlighted here. This is from the video 9/11 Mysteries, right? Watch what it's highlighting. The explosions going off that are far down below the levels of what's going on at the top. These are huge explosions. It's not a pressure wave, by the way. It's been shown, there's no way that can account for it. It's not gas canisters going off. These clearly indicate something's happening inside those buildings to bring them down, to make sure they come down. I mean, see how far down below, right? What's going on up there? It's quite extraordinary that this is not discussed more. And then you see two really anomalous things. Number one, I can't remember which tower it is now, but one of them, you see the top of it, right, begins to topple perilously, like it's going to come down on the street on everyone. And it suddenly doesn't. It corrects itself. And it suddenly straightens itself up. Now, a lot of people have said, there's no way that could happen unless something was taking out everything below it. And that is, of course, the argument. The devices were being used to make absolutely sure all the floors below were being destroyed. And then the antenna on the North Tower, even before the main collapse begins, the tower goes first. And a lot of people say, well, that's weird, because that isn't where the supports are. But if you then say the floors are being taken out by devices, it makes sense that the tower drops down through the middle. And it is all evidence that these are not natural collapses. I'll just read you a few testimonies, right? There's a report. This is one of the fire captains carrying the shore. He said, somewhere around the middle of the North Tower of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode. A popping sound, and with each popping sound, it was initially an orange, and then a red flash came out of the building, and then it would just go all around the building on both sides, as far as I could see. These popping sounds, the explosions were getting bigger, going both up and down and all around the building. This is all denied today. You will find footage of firemen at the time saying, oh, there's like bombs going off, boom, 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 boom. Try and find that now. See if they repeat that this autumn, when they have the anniversary. It won't. Just a handful more. Teresa Valiz managed to get out of the North Tower. She said, there were explosions going off everywhere. I was convinced that there were bombs planted all over the place, and someone was sitting in a control panel pushing detonator buttons. There was another explosion, and another. I didn't know where to run. Lots of people who managed to get out of the tower said that in the 40 minutes or so before they came down, right, there were internal explosions that no one's ever managed to explain. A CBS TV reporter talking to Dan Rather, the live broadcaster, said, when you're down there, Dan, you hear smaller secondary explosions going off every 15 or 20 minutes, so it's an extremely dangerous place to be. And then another fireman, Craig Carlson, says, you just heard explosions coming from building 2 to the South Tower. It seemed like it took forever, but there were about 10 explosions. Not a natural collapse, it would seem. And would you believe, one of the first well-known people to go public about this was Donald Trump. You can just about still find this. So this is on the day of 9/11, and they're running old footage. They're interviewing anybody they can find in New York, and they get hold of Donald Trump, and he said, well, I heard there were bombs in the buildings. Does he say that today? Funnily enough, no. This was well known. This chap is William Rodriguez, who I've met on a couple of occasions. He was the caretaker of the North Tower. Now, his testimony is vitally important. That is why nobody wants to hear it. Now, he was a big hero on 9/11. Look, he got decorated by George W. Bush because he went back into the towers with the firemen and he helped get people out. So he saved lives, this man. All right, so goodbye. Bit of a character, but he said, he and his whole staff heard an explosion, or at least they witnessed it, in the basement before the first plane hit the tower. All right? This is crucial. Here's what he said to the 9/11 Commission. And he said, well, we hear an impact, like a rumble, like moving furniture in a massive way. And all of a sudden we hear another rumble, and a guy comes running into our office, and all of the skin was off his body. And he describes this underground explosion, okay? He had to beg to testify to the 9/11 Commission. They didn't want it on the record, right? Because they knew this showed there were clearly explosive devices in the basements of the towers, never mind what was going up below. And guess what? No, they didn't include his testimony in the final report. Oh, would you believe it? Yeah, you probably would believe it. Another very interesting observation by a World Trade Center engineer who went down afterwards and was looking at what was left in the basements. He said, we went to the sea level where there was a small machine shop, but there was nothing there but rubble. We're talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press gone. We then went to the parking garage but found that it too was gone. On the B level, we found a steel and concrete fire door that weighed about 300 pounds, wrinkled up like a piece of aluminium foil. This is at the bottom of the building. There were clearly massive forces being employed at the bottom, which you don't hear about. And you know what? There's actually visual proof of this. While they're checking away, and they don't comment on it, CNN, right? It's before the towers collapse, you see massive billowing explosions coming up from the bottom of the tower, and it's never been officially discussed, which stands up to what they were saying. All the others are saying there were explosions down below. There's even footage of it, and nobody talks about it, because it's clearly too awkward. It looks like they were taking out the roots of the building. If you want to bring something down properly, you've got to take the roots out as well as everything up there. And it looks ever so right. That's what they were doing. And by the way, it's worth some of the sort of photographs of the debris afterwards when they're kind of clearing it all away and looking at them. And then comparing it to this. So when you demolish a building, there is something they call a cutter charge. So you put them in at that angle and they go off and they split the beams really clearly. Now let's look at some of the debris at the Twin Towers. Does that look familiar? Look how clean that cut is, all bent and mangled. A lot of people think they use cutting charges to make sure all the supports fail. I think the evidence that the Twin Towers were demolished is basically incredibly convincing. And where it gets interesting is that at this stage, the head of security, right, at the World Trade Center was Marvin Bush, brother of George W. Bush. That doesn't prove anything, right? I accept it doesn't. But he was in charge of security. And a lot of people said, all right, if you're saying there were explosive devices in the buildings, right, how did anybody get in there to do it, right? When would they have done it? Well, actually, there's very good answers to that. Scott Forbes, are you here tonight? No. We had a chap who was in the Twin Towers a few days before 9/11, Scott Forbes, come and talk to us some years ago. Look up his testimony. It's very convincing. So he worked at the World Trade Center. He said that about 8th and 9th of September, there was a sudden, what he calls a power down for 30 hours. All the CCTV went off, all the security went down, all the power was off for a cabling upgrade. And the status of heightened security there was lifted at the World Trade Center on the 6th of September. Sniffer dogs were all removed from the premises, all the normal security just suddenly went, right, for 30 hours. And all these blokes came in, dressed in like maintenance gear, doing what? They said lift shaft maintenance. But actually, if they were, they would be very good places to place explosives. It would seem that if somebody did get in there with something, whatever kind of device, that's probably when it was done. So when people say, oh, there's no way anybody could have ever got in there, yeah, they could have done, because they took all the security down for 30 hours. Worth noting that buildings made not dissimilarly to the towers, and the other one that we'll come to in a minute, had burned for a lot longer than the World Trade Center and didn't collapse. Good example, 2005 in Madrid, this building burned for days, didn't collapse. The Grenfell Tower burned for about 3 days, didn't collapse, still there. Cheaply made, hence the horror. Didn't collapse, because buildings are made not to collapse. Which then brings us to this building. So, World Trade Center 7, Ian Martin's song, is something that should be talked about more than it is. I find most people in the wider world have never heard of Building 7, and yet a lot of people think Building 7 is the smoking gun of 9/11. It's almost like they went one step too far. So there it was, it housed the Secret Service, right? The Enron scandal was being investigated there, very well guarded building, very well made, 47 stories, steel frame, built to withstand everything. And yet, would you believe it? A few hours after the Twin Towers had come down, happily evacuated by now, this building suddenly decided to do this, which is a very strange thing for a 47-story building to do that has never been hit by an aeroplane. That's the justification for the Twin Towers. Well, the plane impact, the jet fuel. Okay, but that is not the case here, is it? So, how can we possibly explain how this occurred? Well, it took a blooming long time to explain it. Let's see where it is. So here's where the Twin Towers were. This is after the devastation. There's Building 7. Now, interestingly, Building 6 and 5, heavily damaged, did survive. Building 7 comes down like a pack of cards. That's strange. We are told that it took 8 years for this to be the official explanation that fire spread through the building. It spread from the nearby debris, spread through Building 7 and collapsed the tower. There you go. And then there's the images of the fire. It doesn't look a lot, does it? Even if we imagine there's more fire inside than we can see, it's a real stretch to believe fire brought this building down. But here's how they said it happened. Right, here's real footage of the fire. Do you know what they did? They did computer modelling, and okay, this is like a few years ago now, primitive, where they had to factor in the fires that would have to be there to bring Building 7 down. So you see these images here, they're not real. They imagine fire, which doesn't actually fit with any of the visual evidence, because that's the fire you need to have for them to collapse. And they went, well, there you are, so that clearly was how it came down. Good, well, we don't need to talk about that anymore. even though it doesn't match any of the actual visual evidence, or indeed any of the verbal evidence on the day. So yeah, it's basically presuming much hotter and much larger fires in Building 7 than were really there. And the whole way they say it happened was what's called thermal expansion. So basically the heat, they claim, expanded everything. And what they call shear studs, basically they broke away from the concrete and thus everything collapsed all at once, apparently. It's never happened, by the way, ever since, right? But there we are. Here's the thing though, the computer models which show the shear studs breaking due to thermal expansion forget to actually heat the concrete floor slabs. So the computer models don't include heating of the concrete. That's how they work. Concrete and metal warm and expand at pretty much the same rate. That's how buildings don't collapse generally. But they managed to completely forget that for their computer modelling, so they could give us a reasonable argument as to why it came down. And just before it collapses, again you see this little run of something. Is it where the collapse is just beginning and it's loosening debris, or are these again evidence of some kind of demolition devices being used? Barry Jennings and a colleague went into Building 7 earlier on that day and realised everybody had gone. So happily nobody was in that building. But when they were in there, they said they witnessed explosions going off inside the building. Look up the testimony of Barry Jennings, it's really damning. Now, Jennings died not that long after of some illness, make of that what you will. And it's just weird that the colleague he was with then changed his story. He said, oh, I saw no explosions, even though he said at the time, yes he did, and he backed up Barry Jennings. It does look like he was probably threatened. We'll never know. This chap, we're back to him again, Larry Silverstein, who owned the World Trade Center complex, was interviewed for a TV program called America Rebuilds, looking back at 9/11 and what happened. And he said something really interesting about Building 7 that strongly suggested that it actually was officially demolished. Almost like he thought this was an alright thing to say. And he said in the interview, this is what he said, I said we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse. Now pull it is demolition term. Everybody in that world knows you say we're going to pull it, you're going to demolish that building. When he realised people were going, whoa, 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 you're saying you did demolish that building? Well then maybe the Twin Towers were demolished as well. But they realised, big error, and he pulled back and said, no. When I said pull it, I meant pull the firemen out of the building. That's what I meant. Make your own mind up. It does sound like he was not realising the gravity of what he was saying there. This building was almost certainly demolished. And then we have this poor lady. The BBC's reporter Jane Stanley, she taken a lot of stick for this. I don't think she knew anything about it. About 20 minutes before Building 7 came down, she gives an interview to camera, and she actually says the 47-storey Salomons Brother building, that's Building 7, right, has also collapsed. Look what's behind her. It hasn't collapsed yet, it's still there. And 20 minutes later it did collapse. In other words, it was clearly a press release that had already been put together announcing the collapse of Building 7, because they knew it was going to come down, because they probably were planning for it to come down, that went out a bit too early. And this poor lady fronts the story, not knowing it's not true, and is then attacked as the New World Order conspirator for the rest of her life. But it's damning, isn't it? Because it shows there was clearly a program here to bring that building down. Popular Mechanics is a kind of a spin-off from NIST. I mean, they just say it's all utter rubbish, and anybody that questions there were nutters or unscientific. But I really recommend reading all the works of David Ray Griffin, who sadly is no longer with us, and that's been a loss. He was a very respected academic, good Christian man, very respected in America. He's written about 10 books about 9/11. For God's sake, read them. He's not sensationalist, he just talks evidence. And his book about World Trade Center 7 will just tell you that the whole official story stinks to high heaven. And he doesn't do it with any subterfuge or any drama, he shows you the evidence. And Debunking 9/11, Debunking is yet another book you must read. Why bring down World Trade Center 7? The working theory is 9/11 was at least partially coordinated from this building. Yeah, maybe Al-Qaeda were involved as well, but the big stuff probably happened here, and you had to bring down the evidence at the end of the day, didn't you? Don't people finding the secret control room. So you know what? No one will notice, just bring that building down as well. And you know what? Most people didn't notice. And most people to this day have never heard of Building 7. Now you have. Look it up. It's key. Then what happened afterwards was also a disgrace. Instead of a forensic examination, there was no forensic examination. They quickly piled all the rubbish up, all the rubble, and sent it away to be recycled in other countries before anybody ever got to examine it. There's been no proper forensic examinations. All the claims we'll never know because they got rid of the rubble very, very quickly. And then they brought out, in 2004, the 9/11 Commission report. Key US political hawk, Paul Wolfowitz, looks very happy about it, doesn't he? It's a very funny thing for a book about 3,000 people dying, but anyway, very happy he was that this had come out, and he should be, because it was clearly the fairy tale version that omitted all of what we've talked about today and just gave the official version, and you don't have to worry about it. And if you doubted that it was like a comic book version of it, would you believe, they actually then brought out a comic book version of it. The graphic novel of the 9/11 Commission report. But the whole thing literally is just reduced to cartoons. And that speaks volumes. And that's what they want you to see. They want you to see the cartoon fairy tale version of 9/11. In Martin's song, he mentioned the project for the New American Century. This is also something that should be talked about a hell of a lot more. So, in 1998, these people here, Paul Wolfowitz again, Donald Rumsfeld, George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and so on, wanted America to be powerful on the world stage again. They thought that they were weakening, they didn't know what to do. This is the exact quote from a document they wrote, and they sent it to the president, to Clinton, saying, we need to be strong again, we're weakening too much here. They said in the letter, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. And then on the day of 9/11, what does George W. Bush describe the event as? The new Pearl Harbor. This is the event they needed, and some of these people benefited enormously from this. The wars that followed, the restrictions on freedom that followed, the world changed with 9/11. The fairy tale myths, Bin Laden eventually cornered, shot, then they threw his body out into the sea on the way back because they couldn't be bothered to do anything with it. The whole thing is utterly fairy tale. Was Bin Laden involved at all? Yes, probably. You need a Pepsi somewhere down the line. And the main mastermind that they have caught is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is still, 25 years on, never stood trial for this. And is very unlikely to, and he's been subject to so much torture now and probable mind control that even if he did stand trial, you're not going to get any sense out of this bloke. What they've done to these people, even if they were responsible for some of it, is cruel. The working theory is, yes, they probably were involved. You need someone at the cold face, but they were manipulated. They were helped by some small criminal cabal within America. Not the whole US government, no one says that. But certain minds that knew they had something to gain. It's happened before, by the way. A few moments from history. A lot of people think the gunpowder plot. Actually, they were Paxes. It was widely believed at the time that they were set up to do this, to discredit the Catholics further, which of course it did for centuries. The burning of the Reichstag Parliament was blamed on communists so the Nazis could expel them and rise to full power. Most Western scholars will tell you it was a false flag event. Pearl Harbor, yeah, I mean, look, even naval historians and top US naval brass will tell you that they basically allowed the attack to happen because Franklin Roosevelt wanted America to join the war. Lots of other Americans didn't want to join the war, so we just ignored the warnings, provoked the Japanese, and inevitably the attack came, you know the rest. The sinking of the Lusitania in World War One, full of Americans, a ship full of Americans, was suddenly left vulnerable. The warship escorts that normally guarded it went away and left it by itself, and it was sunk by German U-boats, thus helping to bring America into the war as a stepping stone. The Gulf of Tonkin event, which we are told began the Vietnam War, never really happened. It was a minor gunboat skirmish and instrument error that was spun off into this huge event that we now know didn't happen because there's been so many intelligence reports that have revealed it. So when people say, oh, they'd never misrepresent something like 9/11, yeah, they would, because there's a long history of it. And what 9/11 did was steal away our freedom and it put us into a security state that we've never come out of. And it's easy to forget what life was like before 9/11. And each atrocity that occurs, each dark, terrible thing, cranks up the security of a mob. And now we've got it all over again. Oh yeah, they're saying they're not going to force digital ID on you, but you watch. The next few years, if you don't have it, you basically won't be able to function in society. You'll need that. Look at the plans to get into your bank account, go shopping, to get onto a bus. That gives any government enormous power over your life. Because if they don't like what you're saying and what you're doing, they can threaten to withdraw you from normal everyday life. And then we've talked about this for years, and they're still openly talking about microchipping the population. Oh joy. And we'll all be like our pets, and that will make a good and safe and happy world, won't it? We fall into this when we're afraid. 9/11 made a lot of people very, very afraid. For a while, you would see things like this. There's Obama in a speech, and somebody behind it holds up, investigate 9/11. There was a real movement. There was mainstream coverage of people campaigning for a new investigation because everybody knew that the official investigation made no sense. Leading people spoke out. The late Robin Williams. No matter what people tell you, 9/11 was an inside job. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I'm an Air Force pilot. And based on my experience, the story we've been told about 9/11 doesn't add up. There was a lot of this, and you know what? It's nearly all gone. The lid's been put on it, and now you're told you're a terrible person if you question 9/11. And yet, and he's spoken here, and he comes here sometimes, we have heroes like Matt Campbell, who lost his brother in the North Tower when it came down, who's currently pushing court cases through to demand a reinvestigation just due to his brother's death to get the truth out, right? Some of you might have seen him speak at the Glastonbury Symposium, and he was there just a couple of weeks ago, and it was a very powerful presentation. He's actually doing what we all need to do, is to press and keep talking, be loud about it. And he's getting some quite big friends. Now, whether they're all entirely helpful remains to be seen, but Roger Waters of Pink Floyd even is now got on board. And he's a controversial figure. He speaks his mind on things, some don't think he should, but anyway, he's now been speaking out about 9/11, and certainly he's getting the conversation going, whether you like him or not, it's another matter. We need this kind of pressure, because at the end of the day, this is what's going to be forced down your throats in the next few weeks. 25th anniversary, jolly fairy tale stuff. They'll tell a lie. They'll restate the lie to the world. But you've heard, even just this evening, there's another side to this. You owe it to yourselves to go and look it up. Just want 3 good starter websites. And a lot of the old 9/11 websites we used to have now gone, sadly. There's a few hanging on. 911truth.org, very useful, lots of good links. They're very similarly named AE 9/11 Truth, which stands for Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, is crucial reading. They're not conspiracy theorists. They're people in the know about buildings and what happens to buildings when they collapse naturally and what happens when they're demolished. Read it. It will blow your mind. These are scientists. And it's now an archive website. Somebody's resurrected it. The old Pilots for 9/11 Truth website is back up. And it's not updated. Have a look at pf911t.org. In other words, Pilots for 911truth.org. And again, you've got crucial testimony there from people in the business who know that what happened, or at least what we're told happened, simply does not make sense. Many, many good books out there, but they're getting hard to find. Read David Gray Griffith's books, every single one of them. And if you're going to start with one, try 9/11 Unmasked, or Debunking 9/11 Debunking, but the classic was The New Pearl Harbor. There's also Ian Henshaw's book, Where's the Griffith Army. There's a lot of stuff out there, but you will not see it advertised or promoted very much anymore. Read it while you can. I'm going to shamelessly do an advert here. If you want the short versions, but very helpful, 9/11 is covered in great detail in some of my books. The Truth Agenda, which has photographs as well, Conspiracies, and The New Heretics. I keep putting it out there because I think 9/11 still needs to be kept alive. And we need to keep alive the lessons. It's lovely, actually, for a few years when there was nothing on the site. After 9/11, they shot these two lights up into the sky as a monument. And whatever you think caused 9/11, lives were lost. And I thought that was beautiful. And I remember them. Now, well, we've got the Freedom Tower built on it. And it's an ironic name, isn't it, given that so much freedom was lost from 9/11 onwards. Now we have the Freedom Tower, kind of a freedom. Look how small liberty looks next to it. That's kind of a metaphor for you. Liberty and freedom is certainly under threat. There's an awful long way to go with 9/11. There's a lot more we need to expose. You can help by doing it yourself, and you'll need to do a bit of reading and research, but it won't take you long to realise there's so much more to know. And all I've managed to do this evening, even despite being here for an hour and 3/4, is scratch the surface. So much more. But I hope that gave you a better idea than you started with. Thanks for coming, and look, just get out there and keep the conversation alive. And thank you for coming. Thank you. I was hoping there was a question, but I've gone on too long. I'll be here packing up. If you want to chat, please do. There's Nexus at the back. There's the light over there. There's Helen there. There's some books. Do have a look. If you're not on a mailing list, do put your name on. It's there. And if you want to come for a drink with us, and we can all chat at the pub. We'll be going over in a minute to, what's it called? Oh yeah, the 6 golden martlets. Are you with us, boots? And it's just up here on the right in the mall, and we'll be there soon. Thanks for coming. We will be back here, by the way, for October, 13th of October. Speaker to be announced very soon. Make sure you're on the mailing list. Thanks a lot. Have a safe journey.
The information where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.